The intergalactic university system had, over the course of its illustrious 5-millennium history, transformed the pursuit of knowledge into something that would have made medieval monks weep with recognition. Academic positions were distributed based on a complex algorithm involving publication frequency, citation indices, and the ability to make simple concepts sound impossibly complicated. The entire system operated on what scholars politely called competitive intellectualism, though more honest observers might have described it as an academic Hunger Games with tenure as the ultimate prize. At the apex of this scholarly pyramid sat the Department of Xenological Studies, where professors competed for research grants with the desperate intensity of gladiators fighting for their lives. The most prestigious research involved studying hazardous species, which were classified as any life forms that had managed to develop technology without the benefit of proper academic oversight. The fact that these species had somehow achieved interstellar capability without following established theoretical frameworks was considered either deeply suspicious or profoundly embarrassing, depending on one's perspective. The humans of Terra 3 occupied a special place in this academic hierarchy, having been classified as Death Planet inhabitants under the university's Safety and Ethics Committee recommendations. Official policy stated that human research required extensive preliminary observation periods and comprehensive safety protocols, which translated roughly to observe from very far away and under no circumstances should you actually talk to one. The reasoning was that humans had developed their technology through a process that academic theorists found deeply disturbing: trial and error combined with what appeared to be industrial-scale stubbornness. Professor Thex'miral of the Celestial Studies Department had been staring at his publication record for the past 6 standard hours, his tentacled appendages cycling through the spectrum of colors that indicated increasing academic desperation. His latest paper, Theoretical Analysis of Deathworlder Tool Usage Based on Electromagnetic Signature Interpretation, had been rejected by the Journal of Advanced Xenological Theory for the 9th time, citing insufficient empirical data and speculative methodology. The Celestial Studies Department, despite its impressive reputation and even more impressive budget allocations, had never actually studied a living Deathworlder. Their most celebrated research was based entirely on long-range sensor data and mathematical models, which had led to papers with titles like Probabilistic Assessment of Primitive Technology Integration and Statistical Analysis of Tool Usage Patterns Among Non-Academic Species. These papers were academically rigorous, properly cited, and completely useless for understanding how humans actually worked. Thex'miral's research vessel, the Theoretical Advancement of Knowledge Through Proper Methodology, drifted at the edge of the Sol system's academic safety zone, its sensors recording the same distant observations that had been deemed appropriately cautious by the university's Risk Assessment Board. 4 years of watching humans from afar had produced exactly 0 breakthrough discoveries, unless one counted his paper on influential analysis of primitive construction techniques, which had been politely ignored by every journal that mattered. Occasion of aspect suit, he addressed his ship's AI, his voice carrying the particular desperation of someone facing the academic equivalent of professional extinction. What would be the minimum observation time required for direct specimen analysis? The AI's response carried what could only be described as algorithmic concern. Professor, current university protocols require a preliminary observation period of no less than 50 standard years, followed by comprehensive risk assessment, ethical review, and safety committee approval. Total estimated timeline is approximately 127 years, assuming no committee delays or procedural complications. Thex'miral's chromatic skin shifted to what his people called tenure denial purple. 127 years. His colleagues at the Andromedan Institute had just published a groundbreaking study on the social dynamics of sentient crystals, and were being celebrated as the leading xenological minds of their generation. Meanwhile, he was collecting sensor readings like some kind of cosmic bird watcher. Hypothetically, he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was about to discover that the universe had strong opinions about academic shortcuts, what would be the detection risk for a brief direct observation? Professor, I must strongly advise against any unauthorized specimen contact. University regulations are quite specific regarding purely theoretical inquiry academic pursuit. 7. The AI paused, processing data with the mechanical equivalent of academic anxiety. Theoretical detection probability would be approximately 6.2% assuming optimal conditions and an observation period of less than 2 standard hours, However, I must note that violation of university protocols carries sanctions including but not limited to research privilege revocation, tenure cancellation, and mandatory reassignment to undergraduate instruction duties. Understood. Prepare the specimen acquisition beam, and thus began what would later be known in academic circles as the Nakamura paradigm shift, though the university's official records would forever refer to it as Incident Report 847 Academic Disaster, a case study in procedural non-compliance. Felix Nakamura was having what he considered a perfectly normal Thursday morning, which for a carpenter meant trying to figure out why the contractor had specified load-bearing beams that couldn't actually bear the loads they were supposed to support. He was quite literally elbow-deep in structural problem-solving when the universe decided to conduct an impromptu experiment in academic kidnapping. The shimmering beam that enveloped him was certainly unexpected, but Felix had spent enough time around construction sites to recognize when someone was using equipment that probably hadn't been properly tested. One moment he was standing in his workshop in Oregon, the next he was materializing in what appeared to be a laboratory designed by someone who had strong opinions about aesthetic minimalism and absolutely no experience with practical workspace design. "Greetings, primitive specimen," announced a being that looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a university professor and then given it delusions of intellectual superiority. "I am Professor Thex'miral of the Celestial Studies Department. You have been selected for academic observation to advance our understanding of Deathworlder construction methodologies." Felix blinked, processing this information with the systematic approach he applied to all construction problems. He was clearly in some kind of alien spacecraft, face to face with what was obviously an extraterrestrial academic, and apparently being treated like a research subject. His craftsman's eye immediately began cataloging observations: expensive materials used inefficiently, over-engineered solutions to simple problems, and what appeared to be a complete disregard for basic structural principles. "Right," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone carpenters develop when dealing with architects who design buildings that look impressive but can't actually be built. "And you got proper permits for this abduction, I assume?" The question seemed to confuse Thex'miral. "Permits? I am conducting vital research for the advancement of galactic academic knowledge. Your primitive species should be honored to contribute to..." "So that's a no on the permits. I hardly require authorization to study a technologically primitive specimen." Felix's expression shifted to what his co-workers would have recognized as the look he got when someone handed him blueprints drawn by someone who had never actually built anything. "Technologically primitive," Thex'miral, apparently immune to the warning signs that were flashing like safety beacons in Felix's demeanor, continued his explanation. "Your species has been classified as primitive Deathworlders. While your planet's environmental conditions are admittedly challenging, your technological development appears to be rudimentary at best. Our analysis of your construction techniques suggests a species that builds through trial and error rather than proper theoretical frameworks." "Trial and error. Indeed, your approach lacks the theoretical rigor that characterizes advanced civilization." Felix looked around the laboratory, taking in the alien technology with the professional interest of someone who had spent his career building things that actually worked. "You know," he said, cracking his knuckles in a gesture that somehow translated perfectly across species, "I think I'd like to see some examples of this theoretical rigor." What happened next would later be described in Celestial Studies Department incident reports as a systematic deconstruction of established academic assumptions about technological development. Felix's first move was to examine the nearest piece of equipment, which appeared to be some kind of structural support system. His approach was methodical, professional, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood what he was actually evaluating. Within minutes, he had identified what appeared to be a fundamental misunderstanding of basic engineering principles. "Interesting," he muttered, running his hands along what the aliens probably considered advanced architecture. "You've got some beautiful theoretical work here, but whoever actually built this has never had to worry about whether it would fall down." "Fall down," Thex'miral commanded, his chromatic skin flashing what his people called academic authority gold. "Our construction methodologies are based on advanced mathematical principles that your primitive understanding cannot possibly comprehend." Felix's response was to pull out a small level that he had somehow managed to bring along during his abduction and begin testing various surfaces. "Yeah, about that. This whole section here," It's not level, and this support beam is carrying about 3 times the load it should be handling. You see this stress fracture? That's going to propagate until this whole assembly fails. Stress fracture? Academic Pursuit 7 inquired, its voice rising in what could only be described as computational alarm. Yeah, metal fatigue. Happens when you put more weight on something than it's designed to handle. Felix continued his examination, oblivious to the growing panic around him. And this joint here? Whoever designed this has never actually tried to build it. Look at this connection. You can't actually access these fasteners once the assembly is in place. How do you perform maintenance? The ship's crew, consisting of various species that had evolved on worlds where the most challenging construction project was occasionally rearranging furniture, had never encountered anything quite like a human craftsman in full diagnostic mode. They watched in horror as Felix began a systematic evaluation of their technology, approaching each system with the methodical precision of someone who had spent his career making things work reliably. "Professor," whispered First Engineer Qualvex, a member of the Regelian Technical Corps whose entire education had focused on following established design protocols, "I don't think this creature is as primitive as our files indicated." Thex'miral was beginning to reach the same conclusion. Felix had somehow managed to identify 17 separate structural deficiencies in the ship's design, and was now explaining why each one represented a violation of what he called basic common sense. This is painful," Felix said, examining what appeared to be the ship's primary load-bearing assembly. "You've got this beautiful mathematical model, but you're trying to make the universe conform to your equations instead of building something that actually works. Look at this. You're using exotic materials to compensate for fundamental design flaws. This whole structure could be twice as strong using half the materials if you just arranged them properly." "Specimen," Thex'miral bellowed. "Cease your unauthorized analysis of advanced technology immediately." Felix looked up from his examination, and for the first time since his arrival, he smiled. It was not a reassuring expression. "Advanced technology. This is advanced?" He gestured to what the aliens considered cutting-edge engineering. "You've built the galactic equivalent of a house of cards, and then convinced yourselves it's sophisticated because you used expensive materials." What followed was a masterclass in human construction philosophy applied to alien technology. Felix, it turned out, had an intuitive understanding of structural integrity that transcended species boundaries. More importantly, he had a craftsman's inability to leave badly built things alone. Within the span of an hour, he had identified and begun addressing 63 separate construction deficiencies in the ship's primary systems. The aliens watched in growing amazement as their primitive specimen proceeded to solve engineering problems that had plagued their civilization for centuries. "Acadian Pursuit 7, he said, having somehow convinced the ship's AI to give him access to the construction databases. "Run a structural analysis on the modifications I'm suggesting. I think you'll find the performance improvements are significant." "Sir," the AI responded, its voice now carrying tones of deep fascination mixed with existential confusion. "Preliminary calculations suggest efficiency improvements of approximately 340% across all modified systems." "That sounds about right." Professor Thex'miral, meanwhile, was experiencing what his people called theoretical framework collapse, though humans would have simply called it the academic equivalent of a religious crisis. His carefully constructed understanding of technological development was being systematically rebuilt by a creature who apparently considered advanced alien engineering to be a decent rough draft. "This is impossible," he muttered, his chromatic skin cycling through colors that represented concepts like career-ending revelation and tenure committee nightmare. "Our construction techniques are based on thousands of years of theoretical advancement." "That's your problem right there," Felix laughed, a sound that sent several crew members reaching for their emergency communication devices. "You've been building theories instead of building things. Theory is great, but at some point you've got to actually make something that works." It was at this point that the Academic Review Board decided to make their presence known. The arrival of the university's enforcement vessel, bristling with enough bureaucratic authority to shut down entire departments, would normally have been cause for immediate academic surrender. Felix, however, had spent the last hour getting intimately familiar with the ship's structural systems and had discovered some interesting possibilities. "Unknown vessel," came the official transmission. "You are in violation of University Protocol 847 regarding unauthorized specimen contact. prepare for immediate academic review and disciplinary proceedings. Felix activated the ship's communication system, which he had somehow managed to optimize during his brief tenure as acting construction consultant. "This is Felix Nakamura, and I think we need to have a conversation about your building codes." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when an entire academic bureaucracy suddenly realizes that their standard procedures don't actually address this particular situation. "Are you," came the carefully measured response, "are you the human specimen?" "I'm the human carpenter who got kidnapped for academic purposes, yeah? And I've got to tell you, your construction standards need some serious work." The next several hours were a masterclass in what happens when academic theory meets practical experience. Felix, meanwhile, had made himself comfortable in the ship's engineering section and was conducting what he called preventive maintenance on systems that the aliens had apparently never considered maintaining. "You know," he said to Thex'miral, who was huddled in the corner experiencing what his people called paradigm shift trauma, "this is actually pretty impressive technology. You've just been using it wrong for a couple thousand years." "Please," Thex'miral whispered, "just tell me what we did wrong." Felix considered this while reinforcing a structural joint that had been failing slowly for the past decade. "Well, first you need to stop assuming that complex equals advanced. Second, you need to start building things that can actually be maintained. And third," he grinned, "you need to start testing your designs under real-world conditions instead of just hoping your math is right." The resolution of what became known as the Nakamura construction protocols took approximately 6 months of academic review, during which Felix became something of a legend among the galaxy's engineering communities. His impromptu lectures on practical construction theory were attended by representatives from over 400 species, all of whom were fascinated by the concept of building things that actually work reliably. Professor Thex'miral, meanwhile, was reassigned to a position as Felix's research assistant, where his duties primarily involved documenting the difference between theoretical elegance and practical functionality. It was, his supervisors assured him, a position that perfectly matched his newly discovered appreciation for empirical methodology. The new construction standards that emerged from Felix's inadvertent consulting work were comprehensive, clearly written, and absolutely revolutionary in their emphasis on durability over complexity. The protocols were also updated to include a new section titled Real-World Testing Requirements, which mandated that all designs be evaluated by someone who would actually have to build and maintain them. Felix, for his part, eventually returned to Earth with a consulting contract that made him the highest-paid carpenter in galactic history. He also returned with specifications for several alien materials that made his construction projects considerably more durable, though he insisted on testing everything thoroughly before using it. "So," his business partner asked upon his return, "how was your impromptu consulting gig?" Felix looked up from the alien building materials he was stress testing in his workshop. "Educational," he said. "Very educational. Turns out the rest of the galaxy has been overthinking construction for a couple millennia." The universe, meanwhile, quietly updated its academic standards to include practical experience as a prerequisite for theoretical research. The new guidelines included a note that intelligence and wisdom were not the same thing, and that sometimes the most advanced solution was also the simplest one. Professor Thex'miral, currently on his 3rd month of learning how to actually build the things he had been theorizing about, would have agreed with that assessment. The universe's sense of irony was, he had discovered, particularly harsh on those who confused complexity with competence, and somewhere in the vast academic machinery of the intergalactic university system, a new degree program was being developed. Applied practical theory, which required students to actually build something that worked before they were allowed to publish papers about it. The universe, as it turned out, was a far more interesting place when theory and practice worked together instead of in opposition. It was also significantly more reliable, but that was a lesson that had taken several thousand years of academic evolution to learn. Felix Nakamura, meanwhile, was back to his normal Thursday routine, with the added benefit of alien materials that made his construction projects virtually indestructible. He was, he reflected, living proof that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was the one that actually worked when you needed it to. The universe, cosmic in its tendency toward educational irony, had learned an important lesson. When dealing with craftsmen, always check their work before dismissing their methods. The consequences of not doing so were, as recent events had demonstrated, far more instructive than anyone had anticipated. Except perhaps for the craftsmen themselves, they seemed to find the whole situation perfectly reasonable, which was, when you thought about it, exactly what you'd expect from a species that had been building things the right way all along.